I want you to picture a scenario for a second. Because, we usually conjure up these very specific images when we talk about ancient, monumental civilizations.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we think of kings or grand stone temples.
Exactly. Priests in elaborate regalia conducting these massive ceremonies. But I want you to step away from the throne room for a minute and just step into a really visceral, deeply physical space.
Okay.
So it's autumn. The air has finally taken on that sharp, cold edge after a brutal southern summer. You are standing inside a massive wooden structure. It's corn crib.
Right.
It smells like dry husks and damp earth. And you are surrounded by the entire year's harvest for your town. Just baskets upon baskets of dried corn, beans, and squash.
And this isn't just your winter food supply either.
No, it's not. Sitting in this room, piled all around you, is next spring seed. It is the literal genetic future of your people, just sitting right there under one roof.
Yeah, that's heavy.
But outside the walls of this structure, the rain hasn't stopped for 3 days. And the river, which normally runs quietly a mile away, is now a foot higher than it was yesterday.
Oh, man.
Right. It is creeping into the bottomlands, moving steadily toward your house.
The tension in that moment is just, it's the ultimate terror for an agricultural society. Because you know the topography of your floodplain intimately.
You know every inch of it.
You do. You know that when the water reaches that specific line of trees, it might not stop. It might just keep expanding until the ground you are standing on simply ceases to exist as dry land.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're on a mission in this deep dive to answer this kind of existential question about human engineering, really. When you are a civilization built on a massive river's floodplain and the ground starts disappearing beneath a rising current, where do you put your most valuable asset?
Right, because if a single catastrophic flood can drown a whole year's harvest and take next year's seed with it, you have to engineer a vault.
You absolutely have to. So today, we are exploring the evidence for summit granaries in the Mississippian world. And we are pulling together a really fascinating dossier of sources for you.
We really are. We have the eyewitness, ground-level chronicles of the DeSoto expedition from 1539 to 1542.
Which are wild to read, by the way.
Totally wild. We also have agricultural data on indigenous farming chemistry. We're looking at paleohydrology specifically. Sediment core studies extracted from the bottoms of lakes flanking the Mississippi River.
Sounds intense, but we'll break it down.
We will. And finally, we are examining the physical engineered geometry of the massive earthen platform mounds that just define this entire culture.
Right. So to fully grasp the terrifying nature of that rising water, we really have to look closely at what the river was threatening to destroy in the first place.
Yeah, the engine itself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Mississippian world, which flourished roughly between 1000 and 1550 CE across the American Southeast in these great river valleys, it was an incredibly successful, highly tuned economic engine.
And let's look at the mechanics of that engine. Because this was not a society of small, highly mobile bands just foraging for seasonal berries or, following deer herds.
Right, they weren't moving around constantly.
No. When you are a foraging band, you carry very little. You move to where the food is. You don't build massive permanent storage because your storage is the landscape itself.
The forest is your pantry.
Exactly. But the Mississippians were an agricultural powerhouse. They were running on a farm surplus. A farming town operates on a completely inverted logic from a foraging band.
Because they drop an anchor in the soil.
Right. They stow in one place, the food must be brought to them, and more importantly, it has to be kept. A town of thousands of people basically lives or starves entirely based on the integrity of its granary.
And the fuel pumping through this specific system was an agricultural package known as the Three Sisters.
Maize, beans, and squash.
Maize, beans, and squash. And for anyone who hasn't really dug into the agronomy of this, it is an absolute masterclass in companion planting.
Oh, it's brilliant.
They didn't plow vast separate fields of single crops like a modern monoculture farm, right? They grew these three plants together, deliberately interwoven in a single mound of raised soil.
And the biological synergy happening inside that single mound is just remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
So the farmers plant the maize first. As the cornstalk grows tall and rigid, it provides this natural, sturdy trellis.
Like a living pole.
Exactly. Then the beans are planted. The beans vine their way up the cornstalk, keeping them off the damp ground where they'd, succumb to rot.
But the beans are pulling their own weight here too, right?
Oh, massively. They're legumes. Through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria on their roots, Beans actually pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and fix it into the soil.
Which is crucial because maize is an incredibly heavy feeder. It strips nitrogen out of the dirt aggressively.
Right. So the beans act as an ongoing, slow-release biological fertilizer. They keep the soil viable year after year without needing any industrial chemicals.
It's so smart. And then finally, you have the squash, which is planted around the perimeter of the mound.
Yeah, the squash develops these massive, broad, low-lying leaves. They basically act as a living mulch.
Right, to shade the soil.
Yes. They shade the soil, preventing the sun from baking the moisture out of the dirt during those brutal southern summers.
Yeah.
And they suppress any competing weeds that try to steal nutrients from the primary crops.
So it's this highly calibrated, self-sustaining ecosystem built right into a pile of dirt.
Yeah.
And it produces a staggering density of calories per acre. But, and this is the kicker, the system has a built-in bottleneck.
Timing.
The timing. The three sisters deliver almost all of those calories at once. The harvest happens in the autumn. You suddenly have millions of calories, and then the landscape goes dormant.
Which forces a radical shift in the sociological makeup of the people growing it. The entire culture, the calendar, the cuisine, the labor force, everything becomes oriented around the concept of keeping.
Keeping the food safe.
Right. The whole challenge is getting a massive autumn harvest through the dead, lean months of winter, pushing it through the erratic weather of spring, all the way to the next planting season.
You are totally relying on the physical properties of the food itself. I mean, maize is a storable grain. If you dry it down to the right moisture content, it basically halts biological activity and it keeps.
Yeah. And beans dry as hard as little river pebbles. They can just sit in a basket for years.
And squash, too. Certain thick-skinned varieties and their dense seeds will store for months if you just keep them cool and dry.
So redefining our concept of wealth is essential here. Because, we're conditioned by European history to think of ancient wealth as hoards of gold or silver coins or elaborate jade carvings.
The shiny stuff.
The shiny stuff. But in the Mississippian floodplain, the most valuable, heavily guarded object a community possessed wasn't ceremonial regalia. It wasn't a copper breastplate.
It was next year's seed corn.
Yes, it was the seed.
Yeah.
The math of survival in an agricultural society is brutally unforgiving.
It really is. Like, if a harsh winter drags on and you get desperate in February and you eat the seed corn...
You might survive until spring.
Right, but you will starve next October.
Exactly. Or if a freak flood sweeps through in March and drowns the baskets holding the seed corn, you also starve next October.
The seed is just an irreplaceable asset because it represents generations of careful genetic selection, specifically adapted to the microclimate, the soil type, the pest profile of your exact valley.
And the vulnerability of that asset drove their engineering. Starting around 900 CE, maize agriculture intensifies massively across the mid-continent. The caloric output explodes, populations concentrate, and suddenly they're producing staggering amounts of surplus.
Okay, I have to pause on the mechanics of that surplus for a second because creating the food is only half the battle, right?
Right.
If they're producing this massive surplus starting in 900 CE, they aren't just dumping it in a big pile in the town square.
Oh, definitely not.
A mountain of corn sitting on damp southern soil is going to be devoured by rats, or it's going to sprout, or it's going to rot into this toxic fungal mess in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it would be gone.
So we need to look at how they physically defended this caloric bank account on a daily basis.
Well, the cool thing is we don't have to guess at their daily storage solutions.
Right.
We actually have the written records of eyewitnesses who walked into these towns while the Mississippian economy was still actively functioning.
Right. We are pulling from the chronicles of the Hernando de Soto expedition.
Yes. The De Soto expedition moved like a destructive storm through the American Southeast between 1539 and 1542. And we do have to evaluate these sources carefully, obviously.
Very carefully.
This was a Spanish entrada. It was driven by a lust for precious metals. It was characterized by extreme violence, enslavement, and the introduction of devastating pathogens.
So the men writing these accounts, guys like the Gentleman of Elvas or Rodrigo Rangel, they were not impartial anthropologists taking careful notes.
No, not at all. They were members of an invading army, an army of hundreds of men and horses that had completely outrun its own supply lines.
Right. They were starving.
They were. They weren't looking for cultural enlightenment. They were looking for calories. So they were intimately, desperately focused on where the local populations hid their food.
But that parasitic need for food actually makes their observations on indigenous agricultural storage highly detailed.
Exactly. It's incredibly valuable data for us now. Town after town, Across different regions and languages, the chroniclers documented a ubiquitous, highly refined storage technology. And the Spanish adopted the indigenous term for it. They called it the barbacoa.
Which is just fascinating that this piece of architectural vocabulary eventually filtered down through the centuries to become the English word barbecue.
Yeah, it's wild.
But they definitely weren't slow roasting pork in these structures.
No, definitely not.
The chroniclers described the barbacoa as a raised domestic granary. So picture a sturdy wooden building, sometimes described as having plastered mud walls to keep out the elements, built almost like a small room.
Okay.
But instead of resting on a foundation in the dirt, the entire structure is hoisted aloft on 4 thick, heavy wooden posts.
And the floor is special too, right?
Yes. The floor of this raised room is not solid wood planking. It is made of intricately woven river cane.
Which is an engineering marvel in itself. If you put dried corn on a solid wood floor, any trapped moisture is just going to pool and you get mold.
Right.
And fungal infections like aflatoxin can ruin an entire harvest and literally poison a population.
Yeah.
But a woven cane floor acts like a giant sieve for air.
Exactly. The wind circulates underneath the structure, flows up through the gaps in the cane, and constantly aerates the stored grain. It keeps the moisture content perfectly balanced. So elevating the structure solves multiple problems simultaneously. It removes the grain from the damp ground, preventing rot. It places a physical barrier between the food supply and the thriving rodent population of the floodplain.
Yeah, those rats couldn't get to it easily.
Right. And the Spanish accounts leave absolutely no doubt about the sheer scale of the surplus held within these raised rooms.
The numbers recorded in the chronicles really do reveal an economy operating at massive capacity. When the expedition arrived at the powerful paramountcy of Cosa in present-day Alabama, the chroniclers reported encountering a, quote, great quantity of maize and beans.
And that wasn't just a passing observation, was it?
No. The Spanish army, which was over 500 men and hundreds of horses and war dogs, they stopped and literally lived off that single town's stored surplus for nearly a month.
Wow.
And they still didn't exhaust it.
That is staggering. And we see the same pattern when they entered the Appalachia province in what is now Florida. The scribes noted the region was very fertile and abundantly provided with supplies. The whole landscape was just dotted with these granaries, holding the thermodynamic potential of the entire society.
There is a specific detail from a town called Culigoa, out near the Arkansas River, that I think completely changes the paradigm of how we view ancient subsistence.
Oh, I love this part. Tell them about Coligo.
So the agricultural engine in that region was so dialed in, the soil so profoundly productive, that a chronicler noted an incredible problem. He wrote that the old was thrown out of store to make room for the new grain.
Thrown out. The implications of discarding grain are profound.
Right. It demonstrates they had achieved a genuine structural surplus. They had produced so much food that an entire town couldn't even consume the previous year's harvest before the new autumn crop demanded the storage space.
They had basically conquered the baseline human problem of caloric scarcity.
Yes.
So picture walking into one of these sprawling towns in the year 1540. You would navigate through neighborhoods of thatched houses, and in the yards you'd see dozens, perhaps hundreds of these raised cane-floored barbacoas.
Just stuffed to the rafters.
Yeah, stuffed with dried ears of flint corn, baskets of beans, and winter squash. It paints a picture of intense abundance.
But, and this is the crucial pivot, that intense abundance, concentrated in highly visible wooden structures, created a profound vulnerability to the environment.
Because we have to analyze the limits of the barbacoa. Elevating a granary on 4 posts is objectively brilliant farming practice. Any farmer from any era wants their grain off the wet earth.
Of course.
The barbacoa is perfectly adapted domestic technology for a normal climate. It sheds the heavy southern thunderstorms, it handles the morning dew, it deters the raccoons and the rats.
Right. A structure lifted 3 or 4 feet off the ground manages the daily inconveniences of weather perfectly. But it is fundamentally incapable of handling a catastrophic shift in the landscape itself.
Which brings us to the central antagonist of this historical narrative. We have to look at the Mississippi River and the geological reality of living beside it.
The Mississippi River dictates the terms of existence in the mid-continent. It's a dual-natured force. On one hand, it acts as the ultimate bringer of life. It consistently deposits the incredibly rich, mineral-dense floodplain silt that makes growing a massive, concentrated surplus of corn biologically possible year after year.
But the mechanism that delivers that fertile silt is the flood.
Right.
Rivers leave their banks, And the Mississippi River, draining a massive portion of the North American continent, floods on a scale that is difficult to comprehend until you are standing right in the middle of it.
To understand the specific threat facing these granaries,
Mhm.
we have to look to paleohydrology. There is a landmark 2015 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Samuel Munoz and his colleagues.
And this study is amazing because they bypass the written historical record entirely, right?
Exactly. They look directly at the geological memory of the landscape. They analyze sediment cores extracted from Horseshoe Lake.
Okay, set the scene for Horseshoe Lake. Where is this?
Horseshoe Lake is an oxbow lake sitting in the American bottom floodplain right beside the towering mounds of Cahokia, which is the largest Mississippian city ever built.
So how does an oxbow lake actually record history? Like, what are the mechanics there?
That's fascinating. An oxbow lake is formed when a river violently changes course, cutting off a wide, curving loop of its own channel. That abandoned loop becomes a quiet, stagnant lake.
Okay.
Under normal, calm conditions, the lake slowly accumulates fine, dark, organic mud. Decaying algae, leaves, everyday runoff. It lays down this fine mud year after year, century after century.
Once the monster wakes up.
Yes, when the main channel of the Mississippi experiences a catastrophic continent-draining flood, the water overtops the natural levees. It sweeps violently across the miles of floodplain, carrying heavy, coarse, mineral-rich river sediment.
And it just crashes into that quiet little oxbow lake.
Right, and it dumps that heavy sediment directly onto the lake bed. Then, when the flood eventually recedes, the lake goes back to making its quiet, dark mud, effectively sealing that coarse flood layer in place forever.
It's like a geological time capsule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Munoz and his team deployed aluminum coring tubes, driving them deep into the bottom of Horseshoe Lake. When they pull those tubes up and open them in the lab, they possess a vertical timeline.
Wow.
By analyzing the stratigraphy under a microscope, they can visually separate the fine lake mud from the unmistakable coarse bands of river sediment. And by radiocarbon dating the organic material trapped just above and below those coarse bands, they can pinpoint exactly when the massive floods occurred.
The data they pulled from those cores is terrifying, frankly. Because Horseshoe Lake sits at a very specific elevation relative to the main river channel, the scientists could calculate the exact volume of water required to reach it. For the Mississippi River to overtop its banks, travel all that way across the floodplain, and lay its violent sediment signature into that specific lake bed, the river had to rise approximately 10 meters above its base elevation at St. Louis.
And 10 meters translates to roughly 33 feet.
33 feet. Visualizing a 33-foot rise requires shifting your entire perspective of the landscape. We are not talking about a heavy rain creating a puddle in the cornfield. 33 feet is a 3-story building made of muddy, churning water. And it doesn't happen in a flash, right? It is a slow, relentless, expanding ocean just swallowing the horizon, rising inch by inch over days or weeks.
Munoz and his team stated the consequences with this very dry academic restraint. They noted that a flood of this magnitude would have, quote, inundated the region's crops, impacted essential food stores, and created agricultural shortfalls.
But stripped of that academic phrasing, a 33-foot flood is a societal death sentence. The water overtops the agricultural fields, drowning the stalks. But more critically, it easily overtops the 3-foot posts of the domestic barbacoas sitting in the house yards.
Oh, easily. The cane floors are submerged, the woven baskets of dried corn are soaked, the beans rot, everything is gone.
And the timeline revealed by the sediment cores adds this really intense layer of tragic irony to the story. The data shows that from roughly 600 CE to 1200 CE, the mid-continent experienced a climatic anomaly.
Yeah, it was a relatively arid, low flood window, which is often associated with the medieval warm period.
So the massive 33-foot floods basically went quiet.
And human societies are incredibly opportunistic. When the river stopped sweeping the floodplain, the people looked at thousands of acres of incredibly fertile, dry, sun-drenched bottomland, and they just moved right in.
They expanded their fields.
They did. They built their homes directly on the rich soil. They built their ground-level barbacoas. You had centuries of farmers growing up in a temporarily tamed landscape, entirely unaware of the catastrophic potential of the river sleeving nearby.
They built an incredibly complex civilization inside a dry bathtub.
That is exactly what they did.
But the climate is never static. Right around 1200 CE, the global climate shifts again. The heavy rains return to the upper Midwest. And in the dark mud of the sediment cores from Horseshoe Lake, a thick, coarse fingerprint of a massive flood suddenly appears.
So imagine it. The autumn harvest is completed. The barbacoas are filled to the roof with the lifeblood of the town, and then the river begins to swell.
It breaches the tree line.
It creeps into the fields.
If you are standing in that floodplain and you know the water might not stop until it hits 33 feet, you face an impossible logistical nightmare. You have tons of grain, you have the seed corn for next spring. Where do you move a town's worth of stored calories when the ground itself is vanishing?
The physical geometry of the Mississippian landscape provides a stark, monumental answer to that question.
Right.
When the water climbs past 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, every natural feature is submerged. But the defining architectural feature of this civilization remains dry.
The massive earthen platform mounds.
Yes. The synthesis of all this data brings us to the core argument of today's deep dive. The platform mounds, famously known as the religious and political hearts of these cities, served a deeply pragmatic double duty.
Because of their size.
Exactly. By virtue of their sheer mass and elevation, they provided the safest, driest, most secure storage footprint in the entire river valley.
Let's anchor this in the physical reality of these structures for you listening. Let's look at Moundville, situated on a bluff over the Black Warrior River in Alabama. It was occupied from roughly 1000 to 1450 CE. It is a staggering 185-acre complex featuring 29 distinct platform mounds, all arranged symmetrically around a massive central plaza.
And the effort required to build these mounds it's difficult to overstate. They didn't have draft animals. They didn't have wheeled carts or steel shovels. The mounds were built basket by basket.
By hand.
By hand. Workers dug clay and soil, loaded it into woven baskets carrying perhaps 50 pounds of dirt, and carried it on their backs to the construction site.
Millions of individual basket loads.
Millions. Carefully layered, compacted, and engineered with different types of soil to prevent erosion and slumping during heavy rains.
And at Moundville, the paramount structure, which is known simply as Mound B, is a towering, truncated pyramid with steep engineered sides and a flat summit. It stands approximately 58 feet high.
We see the same monumental scale further west at Winterville in the Mississippi River Delta region. The main construction phase there peaks between 1200 and 1400 CE. At the center of the Winterville site, Temple Mound A rises roughly 55 feet above the surrounding plaza.
So the geometry is just undeniable. If a catastrophic river flood climbs 33 feet above its baseline, everything in the floodplain is erased. But Moundville's Mound B is standing at 58 feet.
Yeah.
Winterville's Temple Mound is standing at 55 feet. Even the secondary and tertiary mounds at these sites often rise 20, 30, or 40 feet into the air.
So when the valley floor was a churning, muddy ocean carrying uprooted trees and the debris of destroyed houses, the flat summits of those mounds remained high and dry. Whatever structures were built on top of them were completely protected from the inundation.
I want to introduce an analogy that clarifies the mechanics of this survival strategy. Think of the sprawling bottomland fields, the miles of cultivated maize, beans, and squash as the checking account.
Oh, I like that.
Right. It is where the daily massive transactions of caloric wealth occur. It's highly productive, but it is deeply exposed and vulnerable. The river can sleep in and zero out the checking account in a matter of days.
Meanwhile, the summit of the platform mound is the vault. It is heavily fortified by its elevation. It holds the irreplaceable capital. It holds the seed stock, precisely adapted to the local environment. It holds concentrated emergency food reserves.
And the leaders, right?
Yes. Crucially, it holds the elite leadership, the chiefs and the priests, who possess the recognized societal authority to ration those reserves, maintain order during the catastrophe, and coordinate the massive labor effort required to clear the mud and replant when the water finally recedes.
This forces us to confront a pretty brutal reality about how ancient societies engineered their survival, because the core rule here is profoundly pragmatic. The monumental lifeboat they built with millions of baskets of dirt was never designed to save the population.
No, it wasn't.
It was designed to save the mechanisms the population needed to survive the following year.
The physical dimensions of the mounds confirm this entirely. You simply cannot fit a population of 5,000 or 10,000 people onto a half-acre dirt summit.
Right, there just isn't room.
Exactly. If everyone tries to climb the mound during a flood, the society collapses into chaos. The agricultural engine of the society is what required the high ground.
But I have to challenge the human cost of this equation. If the summit of the mound is an exclusive vault reserved for the seed corn, the emergency rations, and the ruling elite, what is the fate of the thousands of commoners?
It's a huge question.
The families who built the mounds, who tended the fields, whose ground-level homes and barbacoas are currently submerged under 30 feet of water. Does the leadership simply sit on the 55-foot summit and watch their entire labor force drown in the checking account?
Right.
Because if the labor force dies, there is no one left to plant the seed corn next spring, the engine still fails.
Yeah, the survival of the commoners is the critical gap we have to address in this engine over people theory, because the Mississippian culture clearly did not go extinct every time the river breached its banks. The masses survived. They didn't survive by standing on the mound. They survived by utilizing a technology perfectly adapted to an environment defined by water.
We have to look at their mastery of watercraft.
Yes. The Mississippians were fundamentally riverine people. Their cities were built on waterways because water was the highway for their continent-spanning trade networks. Their daily lives were inextricably linked to the river, and they were master boat builders.
The indigenous nations across the continent had been felling massive trees and carving out dugout canoes for thousands of years before the first basket of dirt was ever laid down at Moundville, right?
Oh, absolutely. They possessed massive fleets.
But the archaeological evidence for this proficiency is pretty rare, isn't it?
It is rare, but when it appears, it completely alters our understanding of their mobility. We have to look at places where the unique chemistry of the environment actually preserved the wood.
Like where?
Well, in Florida, a severe drought lowered the water level of Noonan's Lake, exposing the muddy bottom. Archaeologists discovered roughly 100 dugout canoes preserved in the muck.
100 canoes?
Yeah, and some of those vessels date back 5,000 years.
Finding 100 canoes gathered in a single lake demonstrates that watercraft were not rare, specialized luxury items. They were the pickup trucks of the ancient world.
Exactly. And up in Wisconsin, divers exploring Lake Mendota have pulled up incredibly intact dugout canoes from the lake bed that are 3,000 and 4,500 years old.
Constructing these vessels required immense skill and labor, too. They didn't have steel axes to quickly drop a massive cypress or white oak.
No, they used controlled fire.
Right.
They would pack wet clay around the base of a towering tree to protect the upper wood and build a slow fire at the base until the tree fell. Then they would use fire again, carefully burning the top of the log and scraping out the charred wood with heavy stone adzes and sharp shells.
Slowly hollowing it out.
Slowly hollowing out a heavy, incredibly stable, durable vessel.
So if we apply that well-documented watercraft technology to our flooded Mississippian town, the survival of the masses suddenly makes logistical sense. A sprawling town situated in a flood-prone bottomland would have owned hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these heavy dugout canoes.
Without a doubt. They were moored along the riverbank every single day for fishing, visiting neighboring towns, and transporting heavy loads of trade goods.
So when the floodwaters began their slow, relentless rise, creeping over the riverbanks, filling the low sloughs, and finally entering the neighborhoods, the families didn't panic and run for the bluffs miles away.
No, they untied their canoes.
They loaded what immediate supplies they could, and they stepped into their boats. They basically became their own highly mobile, decentralized lifeboats.
Think about the scene. You have families floating right above the roofs of their drowned houses, navigating through the submerged canopy of the bottomland forest. They could tie off to the upper branches of a massive pecan or oak tree, harvest whatever food they could from the water, and simply ride out the inundation for days or weeks.
Just waiting for the river to exhaust its energy and fall back into its banks.
The dual survival strategy is a master stroke of environmental adaptation. You have the platform mound operating as the massive, anchored, immovable lifeboat. It protects the incredibly dense, heavy, precious things that cannot be constantly moved.
Tons of seed corn.
The seed corn, the central emergency stores, and the political and religious leadership. And simultaneously, you have the canoe fleet operating as a dispersed swarm of mobile lifeboats for the population itself.
It's an elegant, complete system. But I have to bring us back to the reality of the archaeological record for a minute. We have to look at taphonomy.
Taphonomy.
The science of how things decay and become fossilized, or, in this case, how they completely disappear. Wood rots.
It rots quickly and thoroughly in the humid southern climate.
Right. The only reason we know about the canoes in Noonan's Lake, or Lake Mendota, is an extreme geological fluke. Those specific boats sank to the bottom of lakes and were immediately buried in deep anoxic mud.
Mud with no oxygen.
Exactly. That mud is completely deprived of oxygen, which prevents the bacteria and fungi that normally eat wood from surviving. The mud essentially paused time, but a canoe that was successfully used by a family to survive a flood and then pulled back onto the riverbank to dry out and be used for fishing the next summer, it would eventually crack, rot, and disintegrate into the soil.
It would leave absolutely no trace.
None. Because of the nature of the materials, we can only logically infer this beautiful mobile lifeboat theory. We can't physically prove the fleet existed in the exact moment of the flood.
And the frustrating reality of rotting wood brings us directly to the absolute heaviest challenge facing the entire summit granary hypothesis.
Yeah.
Because while the vault analogy is logically sound and mathematically fits the threat of a 33-foot flood, we have to meticulously examine what mainstream archaeology actually uncovers when they trench into the summits of these massive mounds.
We are going to steelman the mainstream archaeological consensus here. We aren't going to just brush it aside to make the storage theory look better, because the dominant, widely accepted interpretation of platform mounds by the people who dedicate their lives to digging them up is not about agricultural storage.
Not at all. The mainstream view, backed by a century of meticulous stratigraphy and artifact recovery, argues that platform mounds were engines of political power and the sacred.
And the physical evidence for that reading is incredibly robust.
It really is. When a team of archaeologists cuts a unit into the flat summit of a place like Winterville or Moundville, they do not find the fossilized remains of giant, purely functional corn silos.
Right.
They find the massive, deeply dug post holes of monumental architecture. They find the footprints of massive temples where sacred fires were kept burning continuously. They find the outlines of sprawling elite residences where the paramount chiefs actually lived and slept.
They uncover charnel houses too, right?
Yes. Sacred structures where the bones of the honored elite dead were carefully processed, stored, and venerated. The summits are littered with the detritus of extreme status. Archaeologists find feasting debris, massive concentrations of deer bone, bear, and exotic fish, indicating that the elites hosted massive, politically charged banquets to solidify their alliances and demonstrate their wealth.
The artifacts pulled from the summits map out a continent-wide network of prestige trade. They find marine shells carried hundreds of miles from the Gulf Coast, carved into intricate gorgets. They find sheets of copper mined near the Great Lakes, hammered into elaborate headdresses and plates. By 1300 CE, the peak of Moundville's power, the site functioned almost exclusively as a highly restricted religious and political center.
So if you look at the mound through the lens of social hierarchy, it reads as a literal, three-dimensional diagram of a ranked society.
At physical level.
Exactly. Your physical elevation dictated your social elevation. The paramount chief lived on the highest mound. The lesser nobility lived on the smaller mounds. The commoners lived down in the dirt of the plaza and the floodplain. It is a social ladder constructed from millions of baskets of earth. And the critics of the storage hypothesis point out, correctly, that nothing in that picture strictly requires a flood storage explanation.
And the critics have a very powerful argument there. I mean, a paramount chief with a massive labor force can build a 50-foot mound simply to visually demonstrate his divine right to rule. If you can make 10,000 people carry dirt for a decade to build your house, you have absolute power. The mound doesn't need to be a granary to justify its existence. The intimidation factor is the function.
Right. The critics also point back to the De Soto chronicles and the archaeological surveys of the common neighborhoods. The barbacoas, the raised corn cribs, were undeniably domestic technology.
They were everywhere.
They were everywhere. The post holes for these small four-post structures are found clustered around ordinary houses at ground level, miles away from the monumental centers. They were not an exclusive technology hoarded on the summits.
And then there is the inescapable mathematics of volume. The flat summit of a platform mound is relatively small, perhaps half an acre to an acre of usable space on a large mound. Even if the chief allowed the commoners to pack that entire summit edge to edge with raised cane granaries, it could only hold a tiny fraction of the total caloric output of the surrounding thousands of acres.
Yeah, it physically could not hold enough corn to feed 10,000 people through a 6-month winter. Most of the surplus, by absolute necessity, had to sit conveniently at ground level in the neighborhoods where people actually cooked their daily meals.
So the mainstream archaeological view is incredibly coherent. Mounds are built for politics, ritual, and displaying the hierarchy of who is above whom. Granaries are built for agriculture, keeping the corn dry on a daily basis. And in the mainstream view, the two structures simply operate in different spheres of ancient life. But I am going to ask the hardest question directly, because we owe you, the listener, absolute transparency on the state of the science. We have spent this deep dive constructing an incredibly compelling narrative of the mound as a safe deposit box. But in the entire history of Mississippian archaeology, has anyone ever scraped away the dirt on a summit, mapped the post holes, and found a structure they can definitively, exclusively identify as a granary built for flood insurance?
The honest, rigorous answer is no. There is no excavated smoking gun.
No sign that says, "in case of flood."
Right. No archaeologist has ever found a plaque on a summit temple reading, "In case of a 33-foot flood, place seed corn here." We have the post holes of large buildings, but we rarely have the preserved contents of those buildings because the wood and the organic material rot away over the centuries.
Motive is entirely invisible to the trowel. We can measure the exact diameter of the post hole on Temple Mound A at Winterville, but we cannot dig up the thoughts of the architect who designed it. We do not know if he looked at the river and thought, "I need to build a vault to save the seed," or if he looked at the sky and thought, "I need to build a platform to be closer to the sun god."
However, the lack of a definitive smoking gun regarding the architect's primary intent does not invalidate the synthesis of the physical, geological, and agricultural facts we have explored.
Let's resolve the tension between the vault theory and the temple theory, then, because I don't believe these two ideas are mutually exclusive at all. The argument isn't that mounds were built as purely utilitarian silos and that religion was just a cover story.
No, the synthesis requires us to understand how ancient power functioned. A monumental structure built high enough to physically elevate a chief above the masses and high enough to host the sacred fires honoring the gods is, by the exact same geometric reality, high enough to outlast a catastrophic 33-foot river flood.
Form follows function. And in an environment this volatile, a structure must serve multiple vital functions simultaneously to justify the immense caloric cost of building it. The mounds were engineered with brilliant water-shedding properties. They were sited on the highest natural ridges in the bottomlands. That engineering allowed the mound to function seamlessly as the society's life raft when the river broke its banks.
We have to view this through the eyes of the paramount chief. Your political power and your divine right to rule are not based solely on your bloodline. They are directly, inextricably tied to your ability to ensure the survival of your people.
If the society starves, your power evaporates.
Exactly. Therefore, maintaining the emergency reserves and the irreplaceable seed corn within your temple compound, or directly adjacent to your elite residence on the absolute highest point in the valley, is not just a pragmatic storage solution. It is the supreme act of political control.
Controlling the vault is controlling the future. By holding the seed corn on the summit, the chief holds the literal mechanism of community survival. When the waters recede, it is the chief who descends from the mound and distributes the means to rebuild. The sacred monument and the desperately pragmatic vault are the exact same pile of earth.
And the incredible thing is, for centuries, this system worked.
It really did.
The safe deposit box functioned brilliantly, allowing the population to endure the river's wrath and maintain their sprawling, complex civilization.
The system worked until the parameters of the environment changed. History, like the climate, is never static.
Which brings us to the tragic, inevitable irony of our story. We have to look ahead to the next piece of this historical puzzle and remember that ominous 1200 CE flood fingerprint we found in the sediment cores at Horseshoe Lake.
The monster woke up from its long slumber.
It did. The climatic stability that allowed the Mississippian world to explode in population and complexity began to fracture. The heavy rains returned. The massive floods came back to the Mississippi Valley, and they came back bigger, faster, and far more frequently than any mound was ever designed to withstand.
The environment shifted in a way that simply pushed their brilliant, basket-loaded engineering past its breaking point. Eventually, over generations of worsening floods, the water rose so high and washed over the fields so often that even the vault couldn't save the checking account. The agricultural engine was overwhelmed, the surplus vanished, and the massive cities slowly dispersed.
It is a profoundly sobering reminder of the hard limits of human engineering when forced to confront the shifting realities of the natural world.
It really makes you look around at our own landscape differently. And that is the final thought I want to leave you with to mull over as we close out this deep dive. Think about the monumental structures we are pouring our own massive caloric wealth into building right now.
Oh, wow.
Think about the sprawling, hypercooled data centers we are building in the desert to house our collective knowledge. Think about the global seed vault drilled deep into the permafrost of a remote Arctic mountain, holding the genetic backup of our global agriculture. Think about our towering skyscrapers of glass and steel clustered along the coastlines.
It's the same impulse, isn't it?
It is. Thousands of years from now, when the climate has shifted again and future archaeologists dig down into the ruins of our civilization, what narrative will they construct? Will they look at the sheer scale of our structures and see only the temples of our elite status and corporate vanity? Or will they look closer, analyze the stratigraphy of our drowned coastlines, and recognize the desperate engineered vaults where we tried to keep our own society's engine dry while the waters relentlessly rose?
It ultimately comes down to a question of what a society values most and how high they are willing to build the dirt to protect it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. Keep questioning the ground beneath your feet, and we will see you next time.